For those of you who don't know me, I'm Barbara Trachtenberg. I've had the honor of serving as one of the co-chairs for our 17th Global Real Estate Summit with my partner, Paul Shadle. Those of you who have attended this event in the past or one of DLA Piper's other events have probably had the pleasure of meeting Joy Carlson, our event planner extraordinaire. Joy is such an incredible delight to work with. She's an amazing professional, cool under pressure, and impeccably organized. She's amazing at making all of us at DLA look great. She's planned and executed all of our 17 global real estate summits. Unfortunately for us, this is her last one. She is, I'm sure, looking forward to travel, gardening, babysitting her granddaughter, but she won't be helping us anymore, God help us. I'd like to publicly thank Joy for all of her hard work, dedication, and perfection over the years. She is an amazing colleague, and on behalf of the real estate leadership team and the partners who have had the pleasure of working hand in hand with Joy over the years on this event, Sandy Kelman, Jay Epstein, John Sullivan, Rich Clowder, Paul Shadle, and myself, we would like to present Joy with a not so small token of our appreciation, and there it is. Joy, thank you, please. We love you and appreciate everything you have always done for us. All right, now on to the main event for this evening. Look, it's so light. It's like it's empty. Joy, it's really not. Please, it's fragile. Frank Ryan is DLA Piper's global co-chair, global co-CEO, and America's chair. In his practice, he has handled numerous cases, arbitrations, and trials in a variety of areas, including media and sports, commercial, medical device, and sovereign disputes. He is known as a go-to strategist and litigator with particular experience in patent, trademark, trade secret, false advertising, business, and sovereign-related litigation. A graduate of Syracuse University College of Law, pause for some cheering. Frank now serves on the school's board of advisors. He is a member of the Legal Service Corporation's Leaders Council, helping advising the country's largest funder of civil legal aid programs for low-income people. He is also a member of the Wall Street Journal CEO Council and Thomson Reuters Global Strategy Board. Tonight, Frank will be talking with Ambassador Grossman and Lieutenant General Hooper, and I think it will be a fantastic conversation. So please welcome Frank Ryan to the stage.
Okay. Well, first, let me thank everyone for joining tonight. This is an incredible conference. This group is incredibly important to our firm, and it's the 17th time we've done this, and DLA is 17 years old. The other person, in addition to Jay Epstein and Sandy Kelman, who I want to recognize tonight is Lee Miller. Lee, thank you very much. You've obviously been incredibly important to this event, but also as the founder of this incredible law firm. So it's great to see you tonight. Thank you very much. I want to also thank John and Barbara and Rich for inviting me tonight. I really appreciate it. It's my first time at this conference in person, so it's incredibly important for us to see all of you and to work with you and to hear from you. So again, I want to thank them for having me this evening. Let me introduce the two really important guests that we have this evening for tonight. First is Ambassador Mark Grossman. Ambassador Grossman previously served as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the State Department's third-ranking official, until his retirement in 2005 after 29 years in service in the U.S. Foreign Service and ambassador to Turkey. In 2011, he was called back to serve as a U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He is the Vice Chairman of the Cohen Group, Chairman of the Board of the Senior Living Foundation of the Foreign Service, as well as the Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees of the German Marshall Fund for the United States, and a trustee of the University of California, Santa Barbara Foundation. Ambassador Grossman, thank you. Also joining us tonight is Lieutenant General Charles W. Hooper. When I first met General Hooper, he told me to refer to him as Hoop. I am not going to do that tonight. I'm referring to him as Lieutenant General Charles W. Hooper. He is a senior counselor at the Cohen Group. Lieutenant General Hooper previously served as the Director of Defense Security Cooperation Agency, DSCA. Throughout his distinguished 41-year military career, he held senior military political positions around the world, including China and Egypt. In addition to serving as a senior counselor at the Cohen Group, he is currently affiliated with the National Bureau of Asian Research, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the Council on Foreign Relations. Additionally, he is a senior fellow of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government. I'd like to welcome Lieutenant General Hooper and Ambassador Mark Grossman to the stage with me, please. Sure, thank you both. So it's going to be difficult really to discuss issues with you tonight because there's really nothing going on in the world. So it's been hard to come up with topics, but I'll do my best. Ambassador Grossman, if I would, let me start with you, and let's just get to the real important topic of our time right now, and that's Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Right.
It's captured the attention of the Western world. It's captured the attention of the United States and our NATO allies. And we have been witnessing what would have to be described as massive global assistance for Ukraine. We're seeing Europe take a look at its energy future. We see new countries, Finland and Sweden, interested in joining NATO. Can you help us in the room understand the moment we're in, how significant this war conflict is, and what we're seeing in the geopolitical order in response?
Well, thank you very much. Those are some great questions.
I've got a few more sub-questions if you'd like me to add those in.
Before I start, though, just let me thank all of you for having us this evening. Frank, I also wanted to just say thank you to DLA for this fantastic relationship that we have with the Cohen Group, now going on many years. Our job is to help DLA partners bring value to their clients, and we're delighted to be here. I also, if you'd allow me, just wanted to introduce General Mattis, General Kreider, Bob Tyrer, Hope Goldman, also from the Cohen Group. Thank you all very much for coming here. You get a chance to hear General Mattis and General Kreider tomorrow. So, Ukraine, Russia. Your first question is it significant? It's absolutely significant. It's not just significant, it's shocking, right? And I say that as somebody who spent a lifetime doing diplomacy. But what's shocking about it is that one person, Vladimir Putin, is able to have caused all of this disaster with what can only be described as his obsession with bringing Ukraine to Russia. So is it significant? It's absolutely significant. And I think particularly for a group like this one, it's significant also because it's an assault on the rule of law, right? It's a change in the way that countries ought to be acting toward one another. The other thing I think that's important before we do any analysis is not to forget the horror of it, right? The destruction, the killing, the refugees, the internally displaced people, right? These are human stories, every single one of them. And so while we'll go on and analyze this a little bit, we shouldn't become numb to the human suffering that's involved. I think that's very, very important for me. When you ask me, kind of, can you set it in a context and what will it mean to the future? I guess I would say the answer to that question is it depends on how this war ends, right? And it'll end, but it depends on how it ends. And whether the West, the United States, others can help shape the conclusion of this war so that it somehow allows even part of Ukraine to continue to be part of the international system. I don't know how it'll end. And probably every single person here has got the opportunity to consider. But I would guess that there'll be some kind of ending where Ukraine's going to be split in two, right? Or in some 2/3, 1/3, where the Russians will hold on to the eastern part of Ukraine. I don't know what they will do with it, but we'll have to then kind of deal with that problem. And in some ways, we know how to deal with these problems, right? We've had countries have been divided before. We had in the United States of America for 50 years, one of the great policies that we pursued in the United States, the non-recognition policy, after Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia were brought forcibly into the Soviet Union. For 50 years, we said, we don't recognize this, and we'll have to pursue the same kinds of issues there. If you think of then kind of the 3 or 4 categories that you laid out in groups, and I won't take too much longer. Number one, I think the Europeans have done an astonishing job here over the past, 80 days now. If you think about Germany, Germany changed its foreign and defense policy over a weekend, right? You see what the European Union has been able to do, not just in economic terms, but to provide military assistance. And so I give the Europeans an enormous, enormous amount of credit for what they have done. And then, as you say, you have Sweden and Finland now trying to consider, actually not considering, but actually saying, we want to be members of the alliance. You think about it also from Putin's point of view, and I don't know, General Hooper and I have been in a lot of government meetings, and I sometimes fantasize, what's the government meeting like in Russia, if there is such a thing anymore, where they say, now let's see, what were the objectives we had for this? We're going to have Finland in NATO, Sweden in NATO, European Union is more unified than it's ever been. You save the transatlantic relationships, or how are these the things that we made these decisions on? And I don't know how that goes. I think, and we were talking a little bit about this at dinner, Putin, though, has got a great advantage, right? He could just wait. He'll wait and see how inflation is, how high inflation goes. He'll wait and see about food security around the world. He'll wait and see how steady we can be. I mean, the entire West. And so I think he's still got some power in his hands to kind of extend this through. You think the same thing about China, and General Hooper knows lots more about this than I do. But I think if you're President Xi at the moment, you think, well, this is not going too badly. I signed this no-limits partnership with the Russians just before the Olympics, but Russia is diminished. The United States is distracted. This could go on for a little while and suit me. And then similarly, I think in the United States, I give the administration a fair amount of credit for the alliance management that they've done, for the aid that we've given. But for me, and again, this may not be a widely shared view here in this room, but I think the idea that we've still kept this line between what is NATO and what is Russia-Ukraine is extremely important. And I think that's a line that we ought to keep and we ought to pay attention to. So yes, it's significant. Yes, it matters. There's a human dimension to this. And how it changes geopolitics will depend a lot on how it ends.
I want to come back to Russia, but let me transition to you, General Hooper. We were talking about Europe, or Ambassador Grossman was talking about Europe. What were your reactions to the recent elections in France in terms of future prospects of hyper-nationalism? Should we be encouraged that President Macron won re-election by a comfortable margin, or worried that Marine Le Pen's percentage of the vote went up 8% from her run 5 years ago?
Well, I would probably say B. And what I mean by that is it's interesting. I was here in Chicago for a family reunion not too long ago, my wife's family, and she has a lot of relatives that live in Paris, and they were saying how concerned they were about Marie Le Pen and her policies. And for those of you that don't know, Marie Le Pen, who was following her father's policies, very racially divisive, very positive views towards Putin and authoritarian, very negative views towards NATO and the alliance and others. And I think we should be concerned that the margin by which she is losing continues to shrink. And this does not bode well for a key ally and partner in Europe, France. When you consider that we're currently, we see unity in the Western alliance against an authoritarian ruler that's been aggressive. And I can't imagine the implications of a Marie Le Pen victory that would have not only on the alliance and on our solidarity with respect to Ukraine, but a lot of people forget France has a large Middle Eastern, North African, and Sub-Saharan African population. And I used to tell when I was the director of strategy for the Africa Command, I used to say that, you know, terrorism is a foreign policy problem for the United States. For France, terrorism is a domestic problem. And that would have been exacerbated by a Marie Le Pen victory. So I'm grateful that she was defeated. My family, my wife's family, was elated that she was defeated. But we see these authoritarian trends increasing in places like Hungary and in Eastern Europe. And they could prove very detrimental towards the solidarity that the Western alliance is going to need, not only for this current Ukrainian crisis, but for those crises that we will see coming up and emerging in the future. And oh, by the way, the solidarity that would be necessary in the event there was aggression in the Asia-Pacific region as well.
Okay. Let me move to China, which is, I know, an area of great expertise for you. Now, we've long thought of China as a market that's just too big to ignore. More recently, though, it's starting to seem that the risks of operating in China are at least as compelling as the benefits. There's been an unprecedented flight of foreign capital out of China in the last couple of months, and the COVID lockdowns, along with the strict regulatory crackdown of the private sector, have slowed the Chinese economy significantly. In addition, China's continued friendship with Russia has caused concern from the Western business and investment community. What are you telling your clients who are trying to decide whether to increase or decrease their footprint in China?
Well, we're telling them that, let me answer that last question first. We're telling them to watch carefully the current evolution of the tensions in the U.S.-China relationship. We're helping them. One of the most effective tools that we've provided our clients is something we call a tabletop exercise, where we sit down and we talk through some of the scenarios that we know businesses are facing in China, and we act out ways in which we can mitigate those and who would do that. But look, we went, I'll kind of illustrate where we've gone with China. I remember when I was a student, 1989, I was a student in Beijing as a young captain, and when I wanted to call home in those days, I had to go down to the little corner store in Beijing. You had to stand in line, and you had to pay foreign exchange currency. You couldn't even use renminbi, and you stood in line, you picked up a hardwire phone, and you called out of the country. By the time I got back in 1995, I sat on the school board in Beijing with the treasurer from Motorola, and they were making handsets in Tianjin. And I remember asking him, how's business? He said, yeah, you know, business is okay, but can you imagine what business would be like if there was a domestic market for cell phones in China? Well, a couple months later, the military released the frequency bands, and of course, Motorola's business took off. At the same time, there were spools of fiber optic cable on every street corner in China, because there was no copper. By the time I came back in 2008 as a brigadier general and the defense attaché, I can remember being on a camel in the Gobi Desert and getting 5 bars of cell service, okay? But my point is, when we all started doing business in China, of course, it was the market that nobody could ignore, but we saw tensions in the U.S.-China relationship, but there was an honest effort by the Chinese government to manage tensions with foreign governments in a way that didn't interfere with business, okay? We saw very prudent decisions, policy decisions, particularly economic policy decisions by the Chinese government that would have facilitated the wholesale growth of business in China, and particularly U.S.-China business. Unfortunately, we're seeing tensions continue to rise. We saw many of the trade disputes that took place in the last administration, and many of those policies that were put in place have not been reversed by the Biden administration. And in fact, We're seeing an additional promulgation of laws in the Congress to increase U.S. competitiveness vis-a-vis China. China-Taiwan tensions have increased. That has been exacerbated by the prominent role that Taiwan plays in the production of semiconductors. And so we're seeing companies looking in different directions for diversification, places like Vietnam and other places. So the short answer to the question is, we're watching, waiting, and seeing. We have to acknowledge that these tensions exist. We have to acknowledge the fact that there are challenges in the economic relationship, and quite frankly, the profit margins, which were larger when we began doing business with China, have shrunk considerably. However, the market is still there, and so we're going to have to watch very carefully and wait and see what happens in terms of managing our risk and expectations, ensuring that we are paying close attention to those red flags and those tripwires that will give us indication of changes in policies as we manage our business in China. And of course, one of the biggest decision points that's coming up is the Party Congress that's coming up, where we have every expectation that Xi Jinping will continue his leadership of China. So cautious management of risk, watching, waiting, and seeing, and make sure that we are anticipating changes instead of reacting to them.
Okay. Let me shift topics. We're going to move off of geography. We'll come back to it in a second. You can tell we're kind of working our way around the world today in different locations, different geographies. So, Ambassador Grossman, I want to ask you about a topic I know you're passionate about, and that's foreign policy for the middle class. Would you explain to everyone what this means to you and what are the big milestones in achieving this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And it is of great interest to me, this phrase that's come over the last few years, a foreign policy for the middle class. And I think what's happened, at least for me, was that COVID, and the COVID, as you all know, every one of you, kind of accelerated trends, but it also exposed things that were part of the conversation, but maybe hadn't risen to the top of the agenda. And I think one of the things that COVID, for me, exposed was that there was a huge misalignment between how elites think about, talk about, define the national interest, and how citizens define the national interest. And I think COVID was a big, big part of that conversation. Citizens looked around and said, excuse me, we don't make any PPE ourselves? That 60, 70% of our medicine comes from someplace else? You know, how is it that in the United States of America we came to a place where not one company in the United States of America makes the actual physical things that go into 5G? And so people started to say, you know, we've got these forever wars. We have a foreign policy that seems to work for some people, right? But it doesn't work for everybody. And I think for me, it sort of opened up these questions of globalization. And clearly, globalization for many, many people have been a huge, huge benefit. The billions of people who've come out of poverty, the so many people who've benefited from globalization. But I think one of the things we learned during COVID was that that wasn't right, that wasn't for everybody. And you think about, you know, a time when you could look and say, you know, people in the United States, many people, 25 million people didn't have a pay raise for 25 years, right? And you came to 2016 and people said, you know, and by the way, 40,000 people a year in this country die of opioid addictions, right? And that there were all of these pieces that were all around us, but that yet hadn't become part of the conversation, at least about how we define and how we pursue our foreign policy. And so for me, this question of a foreign policy for the middle class means that it ought to be one of the objectives of American foreign policy to benefit American citizens. And that's about jobs, it's about their own health and their own safety. And I think these are things that really can be done. One of the things, Frank, I think that's most important is to think hard about sort of what's the definition of the benefit of trade, for example. You know, some of us think, oh, well, I want to have trade because it's a strategic effort on the part of the United States to get stronger. That's fine. You know, other people, economists, might think about trade as it's the most efficient way to have countries deal with one another. That's fine. But I think if you took a poll in the United States of America and you said to people, why do we have trade? Well, we have trade so that I can have a better job, so my children can have a better life, so we can live in the kind of society that we want to. And so I think this effort to make a conscious set of decisions about how you pursue your politics, your economics, and your global strategy, to never forget that one of the reasons that you're there is to provide benefits for the larger number of people in the United States of America, and not just the people who benefited so greatly from globalization.
Let's go back to geography. Let's go back talking about another part of the world, and this for a second is the Middle East. The discussions to restore the nuclear deal seem to have hit a standstill. Analysts have been warning for some time that time is running out to restore the deal. In a recently published open letter, more than 40 international experts and former government officials warned that Iran is only approximately weeks away from amassing enough bomb-grade uranium for a nuclear weapon. And this is for you, Ambassador Grossman. In your view, is restoring the previous arrangement both possible and desirable, and what are the stakes here?
Well, for me, I have kind of a mixed view of this, and I'll just tell you how I've come to this. When the nuclear deal in the Obama administration was signed, I supported it. I was one of the 100 ambassadors that signed a letter that said, this seems to me the right thing to do. But what I said also at that time, and would say to you now, is that a nuclear deal with Iran is not an Iran policy. And I think one of the mistakes that we made at that time was we said, well, if we'll do this deal with Iran, kind of it'll solve our problems with Iran. Well, it doesn't solve the problem of their support of terrorism. It doesn't solve the many other problems they cause in the region. And so I think this was one of the cases where people got fixated on this item, this nuclear deal. But they forgot that it was part of, or should have been part of, a larger Iran strategy. So here we are today. I think that President Trump, in leaving that agreement, made it harder now to deal with. And as you say, I don't know how far they are from a nuclear weapon, but it's closer today than they were some years ago. And so it makes it harder to negotiate. The other thing I think that makes it harder to negotiate, and here again, this may be a thing that other people don't agree with. I think that one of the things that President Trump left for President Biden in terms of the sanctions on Iran was a pretty big gift, right? So that they were focused on the damage that they were doing to the Iranian economy. And yet the Biden administration again came in and said, we're going to chase this deal. We're going to run after it. We're going to work hard to get it. And I think it sent a signal to the Iranians that we wanted it maybe a little bit too much. My own view is that I think it's going to be really hard. I think it'll be hard domestically in the United States and be very hard domestically in Iran. And so we're going to be facing, I think, some months from now, or I don't know exactly when, but some time from now, an Iran that will be closer to a nuclear weapon, and we'll have a lot less options.
General Hooper, you were the Director of Strategy at the U.S. Africa Command. Which country or countries in Africa do you see becoming more influential on the global stage, and why?
That's a great question, and because there are many people that believe that the 21st century is Africa's century, and that we are cheating ourselves, we being the United States, if we don't look to invest in Africa as their economies continue to grow. 7 of the 12 fastest growing economies on Earth are in sub-Saharan Africa. And so to answer that, and I often hear, and of course our strategic competitors are investing heavily in Africa, be it in defense or in other economic sectors. China, I often tell people, I spent 7 years in China. I spoke more Chinese in 2 years as the Director of Strategy for Africa Command in Africa than I spoke when I was at the Pacific Command. Because everywhere I went, there were Chinese to talk to. But you can't have a counter-China economic policy. Okay, that's counterproductive. What you need is a pro-US, pro-Africa economic policy. So to answer your question directly, you can never count, and I'll start from the top and go down. 2 largest economies in sub-Saharan Africa are Nigeria and South Africa. And while there's corruption in Nigeria, it's an energy-based economy. It is the most populous country, 200 million people in Nigeria, and you can never count them out. And they do serve as both the economic engine of West Africa, as well as one of the military exporters of stability, despite the fact that they're fighting their own insurgency in Boko Haram. The Republic of South Africa remains an economic powerhouse, a bit more of a diverse economy. And so we have to continue to look at how South Africa can serve in southern Africa in the same way that Nigeria serves. The next three are in North Africa, and people sometimes tend not to see them as African, but Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia, all of which have very diverse economies. Egypt, energy-based, of course. Algeria, a bit more energy-based, but manufacturing as well. And then Morocco, which is actually a very growing manufacturing center in North Africa and an exporter of stability. They have great ties with sub-Saharan Africa. As much as, I mean, countries that are coming along, one of the countries that I look at very closely is Uganda in East Africa. And I'll tell you why. The last time I was in Kampala, I had finished dinner and I was walking down the street in one of the marketplaces, and this particular market was an electronics market. And there was a bunch of activity going on. People were harvesting old electronic components, buying and selling new electronic components, microchips and other things. And as I walked and saw the flurry of activity, energetic economic activity, I was trying to remember where I had seen this before, and it occurred to me where I had seen it before was in South Korea. See, I'm old enough to remember there was no Gangnam Style. There wasn't a building. There was no Gangnam Style. There wasn't a building in Seoul, South Korea, more than 15 stories tall. The entire city was shrouded in charcoal smoke. It was a military dictatorship. There was a curfew. But if you walked in Itaewon, which is the shopping center for those of you who have been to Korea, that same energy that I saw in Itaewon 30, 40 years ago in South Korea, I saw that energy in Kampala, Uganda. So Uganda in East Africa, Ethiopia, once it has an opportunity to address its own internal issues. Ghana is a country that I look at very closely, not only because it's a stable country, they have energy reserves there, and my son-in-law is Ghanaian, and he would be very upset if I didn't mention Ghana in this presentation. And then finally, a country you might not think of, but I've been involved in looking at very closely, and that's Namibia. Okay, Namibia is the old German Southwest Africa. It's down by South Africa. There are extensive proven energy reserves in Namibia. It's a very stable country, and it could serve with South Africa as the tandem economic engines. So there's a lot of opportunity in Africa. I think the United States does not look at it as closely, and I think we should invest now because they have a rising middle class. And if we don't invest in their economic development, make no mistake, someone else will.
Okay. Back to Russia, Ambassador Grossman. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the after effects on energy prices seem to be the second big hit to globalization in recent memory. The first, of course, was COVID.
Right.
Now, since then, we've seen the administration put a premium on bringing manufacturing supply chain back to the United States. So what I want to know, if you'd help us understand, is do you believe that the momentum that we're seeing is swinging away from globalization? And if so, is that a good development? Is that a bad development? What do you make of this?
Well, I think it's clear, and we were talking a little bit about this before dinner with some of us, is that it's clear that there's going to be a difference in globalization. It's not going to be the same thing that it was. And in a sense, I think that's a good thing, because we had come, I think, a lot of us, to believe that globalization was itself a strategy. Globalization had some meaning of its own. When in fact it was a tactic, right? It was a way to organize things. Not a bad way. As I said, millions and millions of people benefited from globalization. But I think it's probably fair to say, Frank, that you're going to see increasing regionalization, right? So it won't be so global perhaps, but there'll be more regions. And I think one of the most interesting things that's happened in the last, I don't say 5 or 6 weeks, as you read about this, as I know many of you do, is this idea now of what they're calling, it's terrible words really, of friend shoring, right, or allied shoring, so that you make a conscious decision about where you're putting that effort and where you're putting that work. So obviously the costs and the capacities and getting the equipment from place to place and the products from place to place, really important. But you can see, if you think about microchips, right? You can see, if you think about rare earth minerals, you can see about all of these efforts that somebody's going to start thinking, well, I could put it here, I could put it there, but there is a friendly country. There is an allied country. And so I think there's going to be some opportunities maybe that we hadn't exploited through in the transatlantic relationship, in the transatlantic space, especially in high tech, which will open up some opportunities. So I think there's going to be a conversation about globalization. It's not going to be the same thing. Regional will take over, and then there's going to be, I think, a more conscious effort to pay benefits for how you make your choices. And if you'd allow me, I think you're absolutely right to talk about energy. And again, we were talking about this a little bit at dinner time tonight. The other thing that's out there is food security. Right? When you think about Ukraine and you think about that part of Russia and Ukraine and the history, this is an enormous, enormous grain-producing country. And it's not a coincidence, as the Soviets used to say, right, that the Russians are moving Mariupol, Odessa, right, because it cuts off grain exports. And you've already seen the Indians have said, we're not exporting grain anymore because we've got our own problems. This is going to break out all throughout the world. And General Hooper knows better than I do about Egypt, but it doesn't take much but looking at the newspapers each day to see that the Egyptians are already in an enormous problem because the grain from Odessa is either too expensive or not coming at all. So there's going to be an energy security question, absolutely. But trust me, there's a food security question coming at us as well.
I've been asking the two of you questions from the perspective of being a statesman. I'd like to just shift. I'd like to flip that for a moment and ask that if you were a U.S. business leader, given everything we've touched on, all the issues that you've mentioned tonight, how would you be thinking about growth, expansion, investments, and partners? And what advice would you have on leading a successful business globally in the world today? So, Ambassador, General Hooper, please.
No, I'll start. There's a couple of things I've been thinking about, and interestingly enough, they're drawn out of lessons that I think we're learning from this current conflict in Ukraine. So the first one is, my old man was a New York City fireman. He was a union local official, and he was a bit of an earthy guy, but one of the first things he taught me was, you can BS the world, just don't believe your own BS, okay? And so what I mean by that is, you can market to the world, you can communicate your strategy and what you feel about your company to the world, but understand internally what your true goals and objectives are. And Putin was in an echo chamber. They told him all of these things. The second thing I'd say is you need to have an evolving, evolutionary approach to business, strategy, and competitions. Why? Because your competitor gets a vote. In my business, we say the enemy gets a vote. In this case, the Ukrainians decided to fight. Your competitor gets a vote. And your competitor might vote in a way that you didn't initially anticipate. So you need to make sure that you're thinking carefully about adjusting your plan in the event your competitor does something that you hadn't anticipated. The third thing comes out of when I was a young officer, I was in the Army War Plans Division, and they used to call that the Eisenhower Division, because then Colonel Eisenhower had been the director, and there was a big sign over the door that said, plans are absolutely useless, okay? But planning, the act of thinking through the various scenarios, branches, sequels, things that could develop, anticipating changes or things that might happen that might cause you to change your plan, that's everything. So plans are useless. Planning is everything. The fourth thing that I would say that would help in business is you have to understand what constitutes a capability. So in my last job, I was blessed to be in charge of foreign military sales, working for an outstanding boss who did not hesitate. He's sitting at the table right here. Who did not hesitate to call me and tell me exactly what he wanted me to do and when he wanted me to do it. And I'm sitting here now, so I guess I did okay. So, but the point is, technology does not constitute a capability, okay? And so we talk about IT and innovations and communications and these types of things. That does not in and of itself lead to a capability, and this leads me to my last point. People matter. Training matters, education matters, how you treat people matters, values matter, trust matters. That's the difference between the United States military and the Russian military, okay? Our people are trained and educated, and more importantly, They trust their leaders, and the leaders trust them. And I think that's applicable to any business or any organization. At the end of the day, people matter, and values matter. And I'll stop there.
I'll just make a couple of comments. I think all the things that General Hooper said are, of course, right. I'd say when I look out, and I'd like to end this part of our conversation kind of on an optimistic note. So when I look around the world and I think about our clients and the people that we are working with, there are opportunities everywhere, right? Everywhere. And so I think if I was in a business today, I'd be trying to figure out sort of what's my focus, kind of obviously focus and make sure execution is a huge important part of what I do. And then there's context, right? And I think about what we try to offer clients, and that's kind of how to get them to focus and do the execution, get the context. And I think all of the things those things really go along with what General Hooper had to say. But the other thing is two things. One is that, plans useless, planning really important. The other thing is we're telling people, of course, a little bit like the China example is, you better have a plan B, right? Because a lot of these opportunities are not for the faint of heart. And to go right back, Frank, to the very beginning of where we were, you think about the opportunities that are coming in Ukraine, right? Because there's going to be, however what Ukraine turns out to be, there's going to be a Marshall Fund, Marshall Plan, call it what you want, for Ukraine. The United States of America is going to spend an enormous amount of money in the reconstruction of Ukraine. The European Union, the same way. And I know that actually DLA Piper has already begun to think about what kind of services you can offer to clients as you go forward in that. And the exciting part of it is, again, you wish this hadn't happened, so please don't get me wrong, but the interesting thing about it is, what do you hear people talking about? They're talking about a Marshall Plan, a Marshall Fund reconstruction that's clean, no corruption, that's green and digital, right? And so that if you could accomplish some of those tasks in helping Ukrainians rebuild, there's an enormous opportunity out there, and that's just one of them.
That exhausts my questions, but what we wanted to do now was provide the opportunity for you in the audience to ask any questions of Ambassador Grossman or General Hooper. So I don't know where the microphone is. If anyone has questions for either of these, yes, please.
So I appreciate the conversations we've had around globalization, conflict in Ukraine. So if we look at from a global perspective what's happening, we also see that we have a natural alliance in the Americas. And later this month, I think it is, we're having the Conference of the Americas in Los Angeles. What's your hopes to come out of that? How do you see that from a security standpoint, from an economic growth standpoint, and from the standpoint of production of needed utilities, assets, or whatever we need for the global economy?
Yeah, I'd say three things. One is that my first hope is that there's a recommitment, as General Hooper was talking about, and as we're having on the transatlantic side, there's a recommitment to a set of values, right? That this also becomes a value-based conversation. Second thing is, I hope also, a little bit like the friendshoring or the reshoring, that there are countries in the Americas that are ready to take advantage of that, and that we, as the United States, can be leaders in that. And the third thing, and again, I don't mean this as a negative, but the third thing is, I think it's really important at that meeting, as we talk about and think about our Latin American friends and allies, that we don't fall into the trap of the Putin-Xi vision of the world, right? Where China is the main power in Asia, Russia is the main power in Europe, and the United States is the main power in our geography. And so I hope that the conversation, the outcomes, the results of that meeting will be powerful for the region, but also recognize that the region is connected to this larger set of geostrategic and geoeconomic questions. That we don't want to give the impression to Xi and Putin that we've bought the division of three.
Anyone else? Any additional questions? Yes.
There's two areas that are becoming increasingly militarized, and that's the Arctic and space. What are your views on those two areas?
Well, I'm sitting here looking at General Kreider, and who
Come
could
join us? do the space.
Who could
piece
answer
of
this question far better? I will speak about the Arctic. I think for a long time we ignored many of the claims of many countries, China included, that don't have contiguous borders with the Arctic. But now we finally started to realize that. I'm happy to see that we've established, the Department of Defense has established the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Studies. So I think we're starting to move in the direction of paying attention to the inevitable competition for resources in the Arctic, but I still think we have a long way to go.
I'd also say that this, I hope, for some long time to come, this Arctic will really be a diplomatic problem. And here you can see a big shift. The Arctic Council is created. There's much more consultation around the Arctic. And of course, the Arctic then has an enormous connection also to climate change. And so there's also that. I also am interested to think about what will happen in terms of the Arctic if, and I believe when, Sweden and Finland become members of NATO. Because that changes the dynamic in the Arctic, I think, in a pretty interesting way. On space, we've got General Kreider here who really knows much more about this than either of us. Would you like to join us or take a microphone and answer a question or two? And if we could just get a mic here, please.
Yeah, so as it relates to space, yes, space is absolutely becoming more and more militarized. And, we've seen this for a long time. The conflict in Ukraine has put a spotlight on the fragility of space. And I think this has been actually a good thing because there's been recognition now around the world and certainly across industry sectors how critical space is to our way of life. We've been saying this, from a military standpoint for a long time. So while there are so many challenges associated with this conflict, that is one of the things that I think is creating a certain amount of benefit and is forcing the conversation that we've needed to have for a long time, which in many ways is very abstract to many folks, which is this idea of norms of behavior in space, right? So when you think about the militarization of space or the weaponization of space, well, how are you going to control that? How are you going to manage that? Well, first you have to start with how do we expect entities, whether they be nation states, whether they be commercial entities that are operating in space, how do you expect them to behave? How do you expect them to communicate with each other, their intentions? We don't even have good patterns for that. So this whole conflict in the Ukraine has been raising this topic. Certainly it's put a spotlight on the criticality of these needs, and it's putting a strong focus on the need to get some of these fundamentals in place, which has been a very good thing. And we need to continue that emphasis, continue that focus, and continue the recognition of how critical space is to everything that we do. And certainly I would think that in your line of business also, you'll start to see more and more how critical space-based capabilities are to the future of your industry sector as well.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up here. General Kreider, thank you very much. Ambassador Grossman, General Hooper, thank you as well for all of your time tonight. I hope this gives you a sense of the depth and capabilities of the Cohen Group. I do want to add that they really are DLA's closest partner and are incredibly important to us in not just what we do with our clients, but also as advisors to our firm. So I want to thank you both incredibly. We're very grateful for our relationship with you. And again, thank you for your time tonight. Thank you for the questions and your attention tonight.
Thank you.
It's a trick stare. Well, again, just to echo Frank's words, thank you, Ambassador Grossman and General Hooper. Not only for the conversation tonight, we're all going to leave the room better informed than when we came in the room, and we're grateful for that. But as I was just listening to the two of you, it dawned on me that what we really need to do is thank you for your service to our country over the years. So thank you for that. So just a couple of housekeeping items. So tomorrow, breakfast and registration starts at 7:15, which I know is kind of early, but that's when it starts. The conference starts at 8. And the opening act is David Rubenstein talking to David Axelrod. So you don't want to miss that. So if you don't make it at 7:15, at least make it by 8 o'clock. Thank you for coming tonight, and we'll see you tomorrow.